Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into something that, well, we mostly take for granted now, but for our ancestors, it was a literal matter of life and death, surviving a freezing winter long before the grid, long before central heating. For ordinary people throughout history, winter wasn't just, an inconvenience or a reason to wear a cozy sweater. It was a creeping, icy existential threat. So we're going to reconstruct those everyday human worlds of the past to see exactly how ordinary families engineered their own survival against the cold. It's an incredible story of ingenuity, danger, and sheer resilience. Let's think about our modern world for just a second here. What actually happens when the furnace dies in the middle of a blizzard? Right, if the grid fails today, a modern home drops below freezing in a matter of hours. We're entirely dependent on these external, highly fragile systems. But centuries ago, people built structures that literally got warmer as the winter storm outside intensified. No electricity, no wires, just pure, brilliant bioclimatic architecture and the absolute, undeniable laws of thermodynamics. I love this beautiful 14th century Persian poem. Try to be like the Corsi, associated with ground. Endure the fire and do not wish for snow. It perfectly captures our ancestors' mindset. Heat wasn't just a comfort you could turn up with a dial. It was a precious, life-saving resource that had to be fiercely trapped and nurtured. The Corsi he mentions is a traditional heating table, which we'll actually talk more about later, but the poem really reflects a larger civilizational philosophy. You see, you didn't fight winter by trying to heat the whole world. You survived by adapting your immediate environment and hoarding every single degree of warmth you could possibly generate. Which brings us to our first major survival strategy, biological furnaces. Let's look at human resilience at its most resourceful and maybe a little surprising for us today, the byre dwelling, or the house barn. For centuries across northern Europe, our ancestors didn't just keep cows inside the house out of desperation or because they lacked space. No, this was a highly calculated thermal strategy. They were turning everyday livestock into living, breathing radiators. Just imagine stepping out of a howling, freezing blizzard and pushing open the heavy wooden door of one of these longhouses. You'd immediately be hit by the very distinct, earthy smell of damp wool, wood smoke, and, livestock manure. But more importantly, you'd be hit by a literal wall of life-saving warmth. The sheer scale of energy we're talking about here is absolutely staggering. Listen to this. Just 10 cows standing in their stalls can radiate around 10,000 watts of body heat right through a timber partition. 10,000 watts! The humans lived at one end of the structure, the animals at the other, and a single low-sloped roof sat over the whole thing to trap all that rising warm air. They were creating one giant shared thermal envelope. And this really illustrates the brilliant underlying biology of it all. You see, a cow's rumen essentially acts as a massive fermentation vat during digestion. A high lactation cow actually generates up to 50% more heat than a dry cow. They were quite literally acting as biological furnaces for the household. So in the dead of winter, these cows weren't just agricultural capital or a source of milk. They were the central heating system. So the really crucial takeaway here is that medieval builders weren't trying to heat up empty space the way we do today. They utilized what we called localized thermal envelopes. By sharing that intimate space with their livestock, they could keep the living quarters up to 40 degrees warmer than the freezing air outside. And they didn't stop there. They paired this architectural warmth with dynamic personal adaptation, wearing layers of thick wool indoors and practically abandoning the colder parts of the house during the winter months. It was just a perfect, necessary synergy between human needs and animal biology.
Moving beyond animal heat, let's look at strategy 2, engineering thermal mass.
Now, when we talk about ancient heating, we absolutely have to mention the Romans. They engineered incredible radiant floor heating with the hypocast system. They fed hot gases from a furnace underneath floors raised on tiled pillars, warming the stone slabs from below. It's genius, really. But here's the catch. Because it required a continuous supply of fuel and a tremendous amount of grueling, non-stop slave labor to tend those fires, this was a luxury strictly reserved for public baths and the elite villas of the wealthy. It definitely wasn't a solution for your everyday, ordinary person. For the ordinary person up in northern Europe, where harvesting firewood required months of back-breaking, grueling labor, the solution was the massive masonry stove. Things like the Swedish kakelug brilliantly captured heat in this complex, heavy brick labyrinth. The secret here? You didn't just burn a fire all day long. That's a waste of precious fuel. Instead, you did a single, fast, incredibly hot burn, using light twigs or even agricultural waste. Once that fire burned down to glowing embers, you tightly sealed the dampers. Then, that massive stone structure would slowly radiate all that trapped thermal energy back into the room for the next 12 to 24 hours. Highly efficient, incredibly safe, and a total game changer for surviving the long nights. Next up is strategy 3, intimate microclimates. Imagine for a second crawling into a wooden cabinet to go to sleep. Sounds a bit wild, right? But this is the European box bed, or the Leets Klo. Popular from the medieval era all the way through the 19th century, this piece of furniture was an absolute lifesaver. It tapped into this really fascinating psychological balance between, well, claustrophobia and profound coziness. It trapped your own body heat so effectively that you didn't even need to keep the room's main stove stoked during the night. And hey, as a bonus, in houses where domestic livestock like pigs and hens were just kind of roaming freely on the floor, the box bed offered a much-needed physical barrier of protection and a tiny bit of privacy.
Meanwhile, halfway across the world in Japan, we see this brilliant parallel evolution of localized heating with the kotatsu. Keep in mind, traditional Japanese timber and paper homes were absolute tinderboxes, so families would carefully gather around an irori, which was a sunken indoor hearth. Over the centuries, they figured out that if you place a wooden frame and a heavy quilt over that heat source, you trap it perfectly. The design eventually evolved from a dugout hearth into the modern movable electric table we know today. But the core idea never changed. Rely on the simple physics of trapping heat exactly where the human body needs it most.
And here's the crazy part. This wasn't just a Japanese invention. Remember that Persian poem about the kursi from earlier? From the Persian kursi to the Afghan sandali, cultures worldwide completely independently realized that heating your feet under a shared quilt was a hyper-efficient way to stay warm. And it wasn't just about pure biological survival either. These under-table radiant systems literally became the vibrant social heart of the home. This is where families would eat, play games, share stories, and just remained closely connected to one another throughout those long, dark winter months. But let's shift gears for a minute and talk about strategy 4. Actually, scratch that. It's not a strategy. It's the harsh reality, the true cost of comfort. We really need to ground the romance of the past in historical reality here. This historical warmth, it came with severe costs and immense risks for ordinary people. It reveals a stark contradiction between the universal human desire for comfort and the intense vulnerability of the poor. Heat was literally taxed. In 1662, the English crown introduced the hearth tax. Assessors would literally walk around, count your fireplaces, and charge you chimney money. Think about how regressive that is. It forced poor households into a desperate, impossible choice. Do we stay warm during a biting winter, or do we board up our hearths to avoid paying a tax we simply can't afford? It's a brutal reminder of how social hierarchy fundamentally dictated who got to be warm and who had to freeze. And unfortunately, even today, relying on these traditional microclimates can be a lethal curse. In places experiencing severe energy crises, like modern Afghanistan, the traditional sandali table is still widely used out of sheer necessity, but it comes with some truly terrifying risks. The fumes from the burning coal under that table can cause deadly carbon monoxide asphyxiation, which is especially dangerous for young children sleeping under the quilts. Plus, the hot coals themselves are a constant, severe threat for accidental burns. The quote here says, "I saw my sock was burnt through," to reveal toes and flesh that were black and charred. This is the harrowing reality faced by people like Sardar, a 38-year-old paraplegic man living in Kabul. Because of a previous spinal injury, Sardar literally couldn't feel the flames of the sandali that his family was using to survive the freezing nights. He woke up to find his foot severely burned by the exact same heat source that was keeping him alive. It's a powerful, tragic reminder of the extreme fragility of life on the edge of the cold and that perilous tightrope ordinary people have always had to walk just to survive the winter. Which brings us to our final point, the modern illusion of warmth. We've completely, entirely shifted our relationship with the winter season. We've replaced the dynamic seasonal adaptation of our ancestors, people who deliberately closed off rooms, wore heavy wool indoors, and, literally shared metabolic heat with their livestock. We've replaced all of that with a very static, highly energy-intensive expectation. Today, we basically expect our homes to feel like perpetual summer. We want every single empty corner of the house to be exactly 70 degrees year-round, making us totally, completely alienated from the natural environment just outside our walls. So that leaves us with a final, kind of chilling thought to ponder. We tend to look back at things like box beds and house barns as just these quaint historical artifacts. But the truth is, they were absolute masterclasses in survival. If the invisible luxury of our modern power grid vanishes tomorrow, could you engineer your own survival against the ancient winter adversary? Do you have the knowledge your ancestors had? Thank you so much for exploring the past with me in this explainer. Keep questioning the world around you, and I'll catch you next time.